A cowboy named Polk told the story at Rath's General Store in Mobeetie, still shaking his head. He had seen the widow's wagon on the creek bank that morning. One horse, ribs showing through the hide, pulling a load of stones so heavy the wheels cut ruts you could lose a boot in. She was hauling them to her cabin. She was packing them under her floor. "The widow's burying herself indoors," Polk said, and every man around the stove laughed. 8 miles northeast, the widow heard nothing. She struck a creek stone against another, listened to the sound it made, and set it in the keep pile. Then she reached for the next one. The cabin stood 8 miles northeast of Mobeetie, on a rise above Sweetwater Creek, where cottonwood roots gripped the cut bank and the wind never stopped. Marit Vangen had been a widow for 11 days. The plank walls Anders built in September already bowed inward along the north face, and the floor, rough-cut boards laid over a shallow crawl space on cedar sleepers. Let cold air rise through every seam like breath through teeth. She owned one horse, one narrow bed wagon, an iron box stove with a cracked rear plate, one milk cow, 2 hens. $11.40 folded inside a Bible her mother had carried from Valdres, 2 sacks of cornmeal, 1 sack of beans, and less than a third of a cord of cottonwood stacked against the south wall where the roof overhang kept off the worst rain. Anders had died when a freight wagon overturned in a frozen wash 2 miles east of the Canadian River breaks. The mules spooked. The load shifted. The wagon tongue snapped and the bed rolled, and Anders went under it. They brought him back to Mobeetie in the same wagon after they levered it upright, and Marit buried him in ground so hard it took a man with a pickaxe and a man with a spade the better part of a morning to open. The burial cost $3. The coffin boards cost 2 more. The wagon repair, the axle, had cracked when they dragged it free, cost another $4.70 because the Mobeetie blacksmith charged for iron stock by weight, and the replacement was heavier than what broke. $11.40. That was what remained of everything Anders Vangen had earned hauling freight between Mobeetie and Tascosa since August. Abner Rowe came on the 4th day after the burial. He was 61, a former Fort Elliott teamster who had worked cattle and hauled government freight across the Panhandle for longer than most settlements had existed. He rode a dun gelding and wore a coat patched at both elbows with canvas, and he did not dismount when he reached the cabin. He sat the saddle and studied the place the way a man studies a horse he is deciding not to buy. Marit stood in the doorway. She had not slept more than 3 hours together since Anders died. Abner pointed at the woodpile. "That is a third of a cord, maybe less." "I know what it is," Marit said. "A cabin this size, this thin, with that stove and that floor, you need 2 full cords to carry through a bad stretch. 3 if the northers stack, and they stack out here." He shifted in the saddle and looked at the stovepipe. "That pipe is drawing crooked. Your rear plate is cracked." "I know about the plate." "Then you know a cracked plate means you cannot run the stove hard without smoke backing into the room, and you cannot run it soft and keep a floor like that warm. That floor is a sieve, Mrs. Vangen. Cold comes up through it like water through cheesecloth." Marit said nothing. The wind gusted, and the doorframe creaked. Abner leaned forward. "The nearest woodlot with standing hardwood worth cutting is past the breaks, and you cannot get there and back in a day with one horse pulling a loaded wagon. Cottonwood burns fast and gives poor heat. Coal from Mobeetie costs more per 100 pounds than you have in your hand. You are looking at maybe 3 hard nights of fuel. After that, you are burning furniture." He was not cruel. He was accurate. That was worse. "You can pray over pine boards if you want, Mrs. Vangen," Abner said. "They will still freeze from underneath." He told her the same thing he told every widow and half-broken homesteader he had watched come and go from the Panhandle in 20 years. Go to town, find work, board somewhere warm, sell the claim if anyone would take it, though he doubted anyone would. The land was too exposed, the improvement too thin, and the creek access only valuable to someone who already owned the section around it. Marit asked who owned the section around it. Abner paused. "Dempsey Cale has been buying up improvements along the creek. He holds your stove note." The stove note was Anders's. The note did not die with your husband, Mrs. Vangen. Kyle will collect. Abner touched his hat brim and turned the dun gelding toward the road. He stopped once, looking back. I am not trying to be hard. I have watched this country bury people who stayed past the point of sense. He rode south toward Mobedi, and Merritt stood in the doorway and listened to the hoofbeats fade and the wind take their place. That evening she laid her palm flat against the floorboards near the stove. The iron had been burning for an hour. 2 feet from the stove, the wood held a faint warmth. 4 feet away, the boards were cold. At the far wall, where her bed and trunk sat, the floor was so cold that frost had begun to feather along the nail heads where metal conducted the chill straight up from the frozen earth beneath. She got on her knees and pressed her ear to the floor. She could hear wind moving under the cabin. The crawl space was open on the north side, where Anders had not yet closed the foundation skirt. Cold air flowed beneath the boards like a creek. She fed the stove another split of cottonwood. The wood caught fast and burned hot and was ash in 40 minutes. The cabin warmed for those 40 minutes. Then the heat rose through the thin roof boards and vanished, and the cold crept back through the floor, and everything returned to what it had been. 3 hard nights of fuel. Abner's arithmetic kept repeating in her skull like a verse she could not stop hearing. Dempsey Cale arrived 2 days after Abner. He came in a freight wagon driven by a hired man, and he wore a town coat and boots that had been blacked that morning. He was 42, thick through the chest, with a voice that carried politeness the way a freight wagon carries breakable goods, carefully, but only because the contents were worth something to him. He produced the stove note from his coat pocket. Anders Vangen had signed for the stove on credit the previous summer, $6.50 due by the 1st of January. Anders had paid $1 against it in October. $5.50 remained. I am sorry for your loss, Dempsey said. He held the note where Merritt could see the signature. But business does not grieve, Mrs. Vangen. This is owed. I have $11. Then you can pay. If I pay the stove note, I have $5.90. That is not enough to buy coal or wood to last the month. Dempsey folded the note and returned it to his pocket. He looked around the cabin with the inventory gaze of a man pricing every object in a room. The stove, the bed frame Anders built, the milk cow visible through the window, standing in the lee of the shed with her breath smoking in the cold. I will make you an offer, he said. Sign the cabin, the cow, and the horse over to me. I will forgive the stove note and see you placed respectably at the Mobedi boarding house. Mrs. Greer needs laundry help. It is warm work. Marit looked at him. She was 5'3", and she had not eaten a full meal since the funeral dinner Etta Sowers brought in a covered pot. The cabin is mine, she said. The cabin is a plank box with a cracked stove on a piece of ground that will freeze a bucket solid by December. Your husband is dead, Mrs. Vangen. Your kin are across an ocean. You have one horse that is already showing ribs. What do you plan to do? Argue with the weather. The cabin is mine. Dempsey smiled the way a man smiles when he has already calculated the calendar. The note is due New Year's Day. If you cannot pay, I take the stove. And without the stove, Mrs. Vangen, there is no point in having a cabin. He left her standing in the doorway for the second time in a week, watching a man ride away after telling her she was finished. But Dempsey had a motive beyond $5.50, and Marit understood it even if she could not yet prove it. The creek frontage. 8 miles northeast of Mobedi, Sweetwater Creek ran year-round, and Dempsey Cale had been assembling freight stops between Mobedi and the Canadian River breaks. Water access made a freight stop work. Marit's claim sat on exactly the ground he wanted. She walked to the road the next morning and saw what Abner had described from his years of panhandle winters. 2 dead cattle pressed against a drift fence a quarter-mile south, their hides already stiff, noses pushed into the wire as if they had tried to walk through it. Instinct had driven them south ahead of a norther that came through 3 weeks earlier, and the fence stopped them, and the cold finished them. Nobody had claimed the carcasses yet. Coyotes had opened one along the belly. Instinct alone did not save anything on the plains. That was the lesson of the drift fence. You needed something besides instinct. Etta Sowers came with a quilt and a jar of stewed tomatoes on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the color of old tin and the wind tasted like iron. Etta was 34, widowed herself 3 years back, a part-time school teacher who lived 4 miles south on her brother-in-law's property and kept herself alive through careful economy and the quiet charity of people who remembered her husband. She found Marit kneeling beside the stove, not praying, kneeling with her right palm flat against the dirt beneath a loose floorboard she had pried up. "Marit, what are you doing?" "Feeling." Etta set the quilt on the bed and the tomatoes on the table and crouched beside her. The stove had been dead for over an hour. The firebox was cold, but the flat hearthstones that Anders had laid beneath the stove, 2 pieces of creek sandstone, each about the size of a bread loaf, still held warmth. Not much, enough that Marit's palm could tell the difference between the stone and the frozen dirt beside it. "Are you checking for rats?" Etta asked. Marit did not answer. She lifted the board fully and laid it aside. Cold air poured up from the crawl space, sharp and immediate, like opening a root cellar in January. She held her hand in the stream of cold, then moved it back to the hearthstone. The difference was plain. The stone held heat. The air gave it away. Something turned inside her then. Not a plan. Not yet. A principle. Her mother in Valdres, kneeling beside the hearth on a January night, wrapping heated stones in sheep wool and sliding them under the cradle where the baby slept. Her mother's voice. "Wood gives heat fast, but stone remembers it." Stone remembers. Marit sat back on her heels and looked at the floor. 20 boards, each warped and gapped, laid over sleepers over frozen ground. The stove poured heat upward and outward. The heat rose through the thin roof and disappeared. And the floor, the entire floor, pulled cold up from the earth beneath like a wick pulls oil. The cabin was not losing heat because the stove was too small. The cabin was losing heat because the floor gave it away as fast as the stove could make it. She said it aloud, testing the words. "The floor is the problem." "What?" Etta said. "The floor. The cold is coming from below. The stove heats the air, and the air rises, and the floor pulls cold up from underneath, and the stove has to start over every time. If the floor held heat instead of stealing it, Marit, if I put stone under these boards, dense stone, heated by the stove, the stone would hold warmth after the fire died, like the hearthstones, like what my mother did." Etta looked at the 2 warm stones under the stove, then at the rest of the floor, then back at Marit. Her expression was the look of a woman who has done the arithmetic of grief and recognized its cousin, desperation. "How much stone?" Etta asked. Marit stood and paced the cabin. The walked area, the space between the stove, the bed, and the table where a person actually lived, was roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, 4 inches of stone across that area. She did not know the weight exactly, but she knew creek cobble was heavy. She had watched Anders haul stones for the hearthbed and swear at everyone. "Thousands of pounds," she said. Etta sat on the edge of the bed. "You have 1 horse." "I know." "The creek is 2 miles. 1.5 miles to the good cobble bank." "How many trips?" Marit was already calculating. A wagon load with 1 horse on rough ground, maybe 800 pounds before the axle complained. 6,000 pounds of stone, maybe more. 7 trips. 8 if the loads ran light because of the mud. 7 trips, Marit said. Maybe 8. In how many days? That was the question. Marit looked at the sky through the window. The light was the flat, pale yellow of a panhandle afternoon in late autumn, and the air had the dead grass smell that came before weather changed. Abner had not said when the next norther would arrive, but everyone who had survived one panhandle winter knew the signs. The birds were already gone from the creek willows. The cattle were drifting. The sky had that bruised, weighted look along the northern horizon that meant something was building. "I do not know how many days I have," Marit said. Then you cannot do this? I cannot do anything else. Etta stared at her. You will save the floor and lose the horse, or save the horse and freeze above a pretty floor. Marit went to the creek that afternoon, not to haul, to test. She brought back 3 stones in her apron, one rounded, pinkish, the size of 2 fists together, one flat and gray with visible layers, and one dark, dense, river-smoothed cobble that fit in her palm like it had been made for holding. She set all 3 on the stove lip where the iron was hottest. She waited. The rounded pink stone, quartzite, though she did not know the word, cracked with a sound like a pistol shot after 8 minutes. A shard flew and nicked the table leg. Marit flinched and swept the pieces to the floor. The flat gray stone, layered sandstone, heated unevenly. One side grew hot while the other stayed cool, and after 20 minutes, a flake the size of a silver dollar peeled away and dropped onto the stovetop with a hiss. The dark cobble warmed slowly, evenly, and completely. Marit wrapped it in a flour sack and set it on the table. An hour later, the sack was still warm. 2 hours later, faint warmth remained. The pink stone and the gray stone were cold. She had her rule: dense, smooth, dry. No cracks, no layers, no hollow sounds. She struck the dark stone against the porch rail and listened. A dull, tight sound like knocking on packed earth. That was the sound she needed. The design formed over the next 2 hours, scratched on the back of a feed invoice with a charcoal nub. Pull up the central boards, the 10 by 12 walking and sleeping area. Scrape the crawl space level. Tamp a 1-inch bed of dry clay mixed with ash and chopped straw to slow heat loss into the frozen ground. Lay 4 inches of selected creek stone on top of the clay bed. Sweep sand and fine ash into the gaps between stones. Set 2 iron scraps beneath the stove feet so the stove sat directly above the densest stone. Relay the boards on shallow sleepers with narrow gaps cut near the stove to let rising heat reach the stone. It was not modern engineering. It was a crude thermal flywheel. The stove would heat the stones while it burned. The stones would release that heat slowly after the fire died. The clay and ash bed would slow the heat from draining downward into frozen earth. The boards on top would hold the warmth in the living space. If it worked, the cabin would not stay warm. It would stay above the killing cold. That was a different thing, and it was enough. Etta watched her scratch numbers on the invoice. Pounds per trip, trips per day, days until weather. Marit wrote it in charcoal on the doorframe where she could see it every time she walked out. 7 trips, 800 pounds each, 5,600 minimum. You are mad, Etta said. But she did not leave. She sat on the bed with the quilt across her knees and watched Marit count stones that did not yet exist. Dempsey Cale heard about the floor before Marit had finished her second load. In Rath's general store, where cowboys and teamsters and the odd traveling preacher gathered around the stove to swap information the way men swap tobacco, Dempsey mentioned it the way a man mentions something absurd he has seen from a distance. The Van Gen widow was tearing up her floorboards, ripping out the only decent lumber her dead husband had left her and replacing it with creek rocks. A cowboy named Polk, who rode for one of the ranches south of the Canadian, said he had seen her wagon on the creek bank that morning. One horse, rib showing, pulling a load of stones so heavy the wheels cut ruts you could lose a boot in. She is burying herself indoors, Polk said, and the men around the stove laughed. Dempsey did not laugh. He smiled. There was a difference, and everyone in the store understood it. Dempsey's smile was the expression of a man watching his own plan unfold without effort. If Marit exhausted the horse, she could not haul freight even if someone hired her. If she ruined the floor, the cabin's value dropped. If she spent her remaining cash on supplies for this madness, she could not pay the stove note. Every stone she hauled from the creek brought her closer to default. He held the stove note. He wanted the creek frontage for a freight stop between Mobeetie and the Breaks. If she failed, he gained everything. 2 days later, Dempsey came to the cabin. He brought the deputy's route rider, a man named Felder, who did not want to be there but who carried papers when Dempsey asked, because Dempsey controlled freight contracts, and freight contracts controlled livelihoods. The cabin door was open. The center boards were pulled and stacked against the west wall. The crawl space gaped like an open wound, dirt and clay exposed, and Marit was on her knees in it, tamping a mixture of ash and clay with a flat stone. Dempsey stepped over the stacked planks and stood at the edge of the opened floor. He looked at the shallow pit, the piles of creek stone beside the door, the ash bucket, and the clay Marit had dug from the creek bank and carried home in flour sacks. "Mrs. Vangen," he said, "there is a difference between grief and ruin. This is both." Marit did not look up. She tamped the clay bed smooth with the flat stone, working in even strokes. "I hold your stove note," Dempsey said. $5.50, due the 1st of January. If you cannot pay, I will take the stove. I can also take the horse if the justice rules it as collateral, which he will, because your husband pledged it verbally in August, and I have a witness." Marit stopped tamping. She looked at him. "Who is the witness?" "That is not your concern today. Your concern today is that you are destroying a cabin to fill it with rocks, and every man in Mobiti thinks you have lost your mind. Every man in Mobiti thought Anders was foolish for building out here. He built anyway." "Anders is dead, Mrs. Vangen. The land killed him." "A wagon killed him. The land is still here." Dempsey's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to argument from women who owed him money. He turned to Felder and said, loud enough for Marit to hear, "Note this. The property is being damaged. If she defaults, I will claim diminished value." He walked to the door. Outside, a woman stood beside a mule loaded with a canvas-wrapped bundle. She was older, dark-haired, dressed in a worn cotton dress with a man's canvas jacket over it, and she was watching Marit through the open door with an expression that was not pity and not amusement and not indifference. It was recognition. Adella Carvajal was 56 years old. She had cooked and washed for the Army at Fort Elliott for 9 years after her husband died of typhus at Fort Davis. Her father had built stone ovens and spring house walls near San Elizario in the years before the war, and she had handed him stones and mixed his morite before she was old enough to carry water. She knew hearth mass the way Abner Rowe knew horses, from the inside, through years of watching what held and what failed. She had walked 2 miles from the settlement where she did laundry for families who had once been posted at Fort Elliott. She had heard about the widow and the stones from a freighter's wife who thought it was funny. Adella did not think it was funny. Marit struck a creek stone against another. The first cracked clean in half, a flaw running through the center that had been invisible on the surface. Marit threw both halves aside without hesitation and picked up the next stone. Adella watched her test 4 stones in a row. 3 went to the discard pile. 1, dense, smooth, the color of river bottom iron, went to the keep pile. Adella spoke from the doorway. She knows enough to throw away a liar. Dempsey, still standing outside with Felder, turned. What? The stone. She throws away the ones that lie about what they are inside. Dempsey laughed. It was the laugh of a man who does not understand what has been said and covers it with noise. He climbed into his wagon and told Felder to drive. The wagon rolled toward Mobiti, and the sound of iron rims on hard ground faded into the wind. Adella stood in the doorway. Marit looked up from the floor pit, her hands gray with clay, her knees dark with dirt, and said nothing. The 2 women regarded each other across the opened floor. "Your ash bed is too thin," Adella said, "and you have no straw in the mix. It will crack when it dries and the cold will come through the cracks." "I ran out of straw." "Then you chop dried grass, not green, dried, and you double the ash." Adella set down her bundle and unwrapped it. Inside was a short-handled mason's hammer with a hickory shaft worn smooth from decades of grip. "My father's," she said. "He used it to seat stones. You use your palms. That is why your hands are bleeding." Marit looked at her hands. The palms were raw, the skin split along the heel of the right hand where she had been pressing stones into the clay bed. "I did not ask for help," Marit said. "I did not offer help," Adella said. I came to see if you would ruin good stone with bad bedding. You were about to. Now I will show you why, and then you will decide whether to listen." She knelt at the edge of the opened floor and pressed her palm to the clay bed Merritt had tamped. She shook her head. "The ground beneath this is frozen. In a month it will be frozen 2 feet deep. You lay stone on this bed, you heat the stone, and the heat goes down. Down through the clay, down through the dirt, down into the frozen ground. You lose half your heat to the earth. My father called it feeding the dead." "What stops it?" "A break. Ash, clay, chopped straw, tamped hard, 1 inch thick at least. The air trapped in the straw slows the heat. The ash does not conduct like dirt. It is not perfect, but it buys you hours, and hours are what you need." Marit looked at the floor she had already tamped. 2 hours of work, the first corner, packed smooth and even, ready for stone. "That corner has to come up," Adella said. "I do not have time to redo it." "You do not have time to do it wrong." The two women stared at each other. Marit's jaw was set. Adella's was patient. "1 hour," Adella said. "Dig it out, mix the bed right, tamp it again. 1 hour now saves you from a floor that bleeds heat and proves Dempsey kale right." Marit picked up the flat stone and began scraping out the corner she had just finished. "Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building while someone with more experience told you to stop because you knew the thing you were building was the only option left?" By that afternoon, the first corner was rebedded and laid. Adella showed Marit how to strike each cobble with the mason's hammer and listen. A bright ring meant hollow or cracked. A liar, in Adella's word. A dull, dense thud meant solid stone, tight-grained, a stone that would accept heat without splitting and give it back without cracking. Marit tested each one, and the discard pile grew faster than the keep pile, which meant she needed more trips to the creek. The first full load had gone down that morning, 800 pounds before Adella arrived. The horse, a bay gelding named Pear that Anders had bought in Dodge City, had made the trip in an hour and a half each way. The wagon ruts were already deep. The return trip, loaded, took longer because Pear stopped twice on the rise from the creek bottom, and Merritt had to unload 4 stones, carry them up the slope by hand, and reload them at the top. Her shoulders burned. Her lower back had gone from sore to numb to a deep fixed ache that did not respond to rest because she did not rest. She ate cornbread and beans standing beside the wagon while Pear drank from the trough. The cornmeal was going faster than she had planned because she was working harder than she had planned. Adella did not haul. She was 56, and her lungs had been bad since a winter at Fort Elliott when the barracks chimney backed up and filled the laundry room with smoke for 3 days before anyone repaired it. But she worked the floor. She mixed the ash clay straw bed, set stones, checked levels with a straight plank, and filled gaps with fine sand carried in a tin cup. She worked steadily and without waste, and she corrected Marit's placement without gentleness. "That one is tilted. Pull it. Set it flat, or the one beside it shifts when you walk." By dark, the first quarter of the floor was done. 32 stones laid on a proper bed, each one tested, each one seated with the mason's hammer until it sat flush with its neighbors. Sand and ash swept into the joints. The clay beneath packed and solid. 3/4 remained. The sky to the north had changed color. The pale winter blue of the afternoon had given way to a bruised gray-green along the horizon that looked like the underside of something heavy being dragged across the grass. Adella stood in the doorway and studied the sky. She said nothing about it, which told Marit more than words would have. Adella knew what that sky meant. "How many days?" Marit asked. Adella looked at her. "For what?" "Before the front arrives." "I do not know. Maybe 3, maybe less." Adella wrapped the mason's hammer in its canvas and set it on the table. "I will be back before dawn. Have the ash mixed and the second section scraped before I get here." She walked into the dark toward the settlement road. Marit listened to her footsteps fade the way she had listened to Abner's hoofbeats and Dempsey's wagon wheels. But this departure felt different. This one carried the weight of someone who intended to return. Marit stood alone in a cabin with a quarter of its floor ripped open and packed with river stones, 3/4 still bare planks over frozen ground, a cracked stove, a tired horse, and a sky that was beginning to change in ways that everyone in the panhandle understood. 3 days, maybe less. She measured the remaining floor with her eyes. 72 square feet of bare ground still to fill. At 800 pounds per trip, 5 or 6 more loads. At 1 load per trip, 1 trip every 3 hours counting loading, hauling, unloading, and resting PRD, she needed at least 15 hours of hauling, plus the hours of laying and bedding each stone. The math did not fit. It had never fit. But the floor behind her, the finished quarter, held the warmth of the afternoon stove fire the way a living thing holds breath. She placed her palm on the boards above the stone bed. Warm. She placed her palm on the boards above the bare crawl space 4 feet away, cold enough that her skin tightened. That difference was the whole argument. It was not faith. It was not grief. It was heat, held in rock, measurable with a human hand. Marit scraped the second section by lantern light, mixed ash and clay, and chopped dried grass in the wooden bucket Adella had left, and tamped the bed until her arms shook. She ate beans cold from the pot, because heating them cost wood, and wood was running out. She slept 2 hours on the bed with her boots on, and the quilt Etta brought wrapped around her shoulders. At 4 in the morning, she fed Pear a measure of oats she could not afford, and hitched the wagon in the dark. The creek stones were waiting. The weather was coming. The floor was a quarter done, and the sky to the north was darker than it should have been at that hour, darker than clouds, darker than night. It was the color of something arriving. Adella arrived before the first gray showed on the eastern horizon. She carried a sack of sifted ash over one shoulder and a tin pail of rendered tallow in her other hand. She did not knock. She walked through the open door and set the ash beside the scraped second section and the tallow beside the stove. "For the stove plate," she said, pointing at the tallow. "Clay slip, ash paste, tallow to bind, and a scrap of tin wired tight over the crack. It will hold long enough to run the stove hard for a day and a half. After that, you nurse the draft or the smoke fills the room." "I need more than a day and a half." "Then you do not run it hard for more than a day and a half. You run it steady. A low fire feeds stone better than a hot one because the stone has time to take the heat deep. A hot burn charges the surface and leaves the center cold." She tapped the laid section of floor with her boot. "These stones will hold surface heat for 4 hours after a hard burn. Proper deep heat, a slow burn over 8 hours, they will give back warmth for 6, maybe 7 hours with the cabin closed tight. That is the difference between a trick and a method." Marit was already mixing the second section's bed, ash, clay, chopped dry grass, worked with water from the pail until it held together when squeezed, but crumbled when dropped. Adella watched her hands and said nothing for a full minute, which was as close to approval as Adella came. The second lesson unfolded through labor. Stone selection. Adella made Marit bring every cobble from the pile to the door and strike it with the mason's hammer against the threshold stone. Some rang bright and sharp, quartz veins, hidden fissures, air pockets that would expand near heat and crack. Those went back to the discard pile. Some gave a flat, dull report, a sound like hitting packed dirt. Dense, tight-grained. Those stayed. "You listen to the stone the way you listen to a horse's hoof," Adella said. "A bad sound means a problem you cannot see. The stone will not tell you where the crack is. It will only tell you the crack exists. That is enough." By mid-morning, the second quarter was laid. Marit's hands had stopped bleeding where Adella's hammer replaced palm pressing, but new blisters formed along the web of her thumb where she gripped the short handle. She wrapped the blisters with a strip of cotton torn from a worn-out petticoat and kept working. Purr made the third trip to the creek at 10 in the morning. The wagon road was rutted now from repeated passes, and the wheels found the old tracks and dropped into them, which made steering easier, but also meant the ruts would fill with ice if the temperature dropped. The creek bank where the best cobbles lay was a south-facing shelf of gravel and river-smooth stone, exposed by decades of spring floods. Anders had pulled hearthstones from this shelf. Now Marit stripped it bare. She loaded by hand. Each stone weighed between 15 and 40 pounds. She lifted with her legs because Adella had told her that lifting with the back would finish her before the floor did, and she believed it because the ache in her lower spine was already the worst pain she had felt since childbirth, and that had been a baby who did not live 3 years ago in a rented room in Dodge City that smelled like tallow and dust. Per slipped on creek ice during the third trip. His left foreleg shot out on a frozen puddle where the bank seep crossed the path, and for one terrible second the horse went down on his chest with the loaded wagon pushing against the traces. Marit threw herself at the brake lever and hauled it back before the wheels could roll. Per scrambled up, blowing hard, favoring the left foreleg. Marit walked him in a circle and watched. No limp after 30 paces. But the slip cost time. She had to unload half the wagon, walk Per up the worst grade unburdened, and then carry the remaining stones uphill in her apron and a flour sack, 4 trips up the slope with 40 pounds in each load. Her right palm opened again where a hidden edge of stone caught the split she had been nursing. Blood ran between her fingers and mixed with the clay dust until her hands looked like something pulled from the ground. When she reached the cabin, the third load stacked beside the door, Adella was patching the stove plate. She had mixed stove black, soot and linseed oil with clay slip and tallow into a thick paste, pressed it into the crack from the inside while the stove was cold, and now she was wiring a piece of flat tin over the patch from the outside. The tin had come from a lid of a lard pail. She bent it flush with pliers she had brought in her bundle and twisted the wire tight with a stick. "Do not test it until tonight," Adella said. "The paste needs to set. If you fire it wet, the steam blows the patch and you have a bigger hole." "Tonight? How long will the patch last?" 3 weeks if you treat the stove right. 3 days if you fire it angry." Adella's third lesson came that afternoon while Marit laid stones in the third section, draft control. The stove had a single damper, a sliding plate on the stovepipe that Anders had made from a tin square riveted to a rod. Open damper meant high draft. Air pulled through the firebox hard. The fire burned fast and hot. Heat went up the pipe. Closed damper meant low draft. Air entered slowly. The fire burned lower, and more heat stayed in the firebox and radiated into the room and the floor. "A roaring stove feels good to a cold person," Adella said, "but a roaring stove with a patched crack sends smoke into the room, and smoke in a closed cabin kills faster than cold. Your stove, with this patch, can run at half draft for 8 hours without smoking. Full draft, maybe 90 minutes before the patch leaks. You plan your burns the way you plan your meals. Do not eat everything at once." Marit laid 2 more stones while Adella talked. Each one seated with the hammer, checked for level with the straight plank, adjusted with sand. The rhythm was becoming automatic. Lift, test, seat, check, fill. 30 pounds at a time. Her body was learning the motion the way her hands had learned to milk, through repetition until thought was unnecessary. By late afternoon, the third quarter was half laid, 2.5 sections done, 1.5 remaining. Marit's arms trembled when she lifted the water pail. She had eaten once since dawn, cold cornbread with a scrape of molasses, and the cornmeal sack was visibly lighter than it had been the day before. Abner Rowe appeared at the edge of the property, riding the same dun gelding, coming from the direction of a cattle camp south of the creek. He reined up and sat his horse and looked at the operation. The wagon with its side rails dark with clay, the discard pile of cracked and rejected stones, the stacks of kept cobbles sorted by size beside the door, and through the open doorway, the half-finished floor where gray stone and pale ash bed formed a rough mosaic over what had been bare frozen ground. He dismounted. That alone told Marit something. The first time he came, he had not bothered to get off his horse. Abner walked to the doorway and looked down at the floor. He pressed the toe of his boot against a laid stone and felt it firm and level. He knelt, slowly, because his knees were 61 years old and did not kneel without argument, and laid his palm flat against the stone near the stove. His hand stayed there for a long time. "It is warm," he said. "The stove ran this morning for 2 hours. It has been out since noon." Abner looked at the stove. Cold firebox, cold pipe. 4 hours since the last burn, and the stone under his hand still held heat. He looked at the far edge where the planks covered bare crawl space, and he laid his other hand there. The difference was immediate and obvious. Warm stone, cold plank. He stood. His expression was not converted. It was confused, which was worse for his pride and better for the truth. "How much more?" he asked. "One full section, maybe 400 more stones. One more load. 2 if the good cobble is picked over." "The front is moving." Abner pointed north. The horizon had changed since morning. The bruised gray-green had thickened into a solid shelf of dark cloud, low and flat, moving south with a visible edge. "I have seen shelves like that arrive in 12 hours, sometimes 8. Then I have 8 hours. You have 1 horse and 8 hours and 400 stones to haul. It does not fit." "It does not have to all fit. Every stone I lay is 1 more stone holding heat. 3/4 of a floor is better than none." Abner looked at Adella, who stood beside the stove with her arms crossed. "You are helping her," he said. "I am teaching her. There is a difference." "Teaching her to do what? Fill a cabin with rocks before a norther freezes her solid?" "Teaching her to read stone. Teaching her to bed a floor that holds heat. Teaching her what my father taught me when I was young enough to carry and old enough to listen." Adella's voice was level. "She's doing the carrying. I am making sure it is not wasted." Abner looked back at Marit. "A woman alone cannot outbuild a panhandle norther." "She is not alone," Adella said. Abner left without another word. He did not help. He did not offer. But he did not repeat his advice to leave. The 4th trip to the creek nearly broke the project. Per made the downhill run well enough, but the creek bank was chewed up from repeated loading, and the best cobbles were gone from the near shelf. Marit had to wade the shallow ford to the far bank, where larger stones lay in a gravel bar exposed by low water. The creek was ankle-deep and cold enough to make her feet numb by the second crossing. She carried stones back across the ford in her apron, 10 trips for 300 pounds, and loaded the wagon on the near bank. On the return, the right rear wheel sank in a soft spot where the creek seep had thawed the frozen road into black mud. The wagon lurched. Per strained against the traces and could not pull free. Marit unloaded 200 pounds of stone, stacking them beside the road, and Per dragged the lightened wagon out of the mud. She reloaded the 200 pounds, her arms shaking so badly that she dropped a stone on her own foot and spent 30 seconds bent over with her hands on her knees, breathing through the pain. When she reached the cabin, Etta Sowers was standing in the doorway with 2 empty feed sacks and a lantern. "I did not come to help," Etta said. The words were the same shape as Adella's, and Marit almost smiled. "Then what did you come for?" "The horse needs resting between hauls. I came to hold the lantern while you lay stone, so you do not waste the resting time in the dark." Etta still did not believe. She had said so plainly, and nothing in her face suggested she had changed her mind. But she was here, and the lantern threw steady light across the 3rd section, while Marit seeded stones and filled gaps until her hands moved without instructions from her brain. At 9 o'clock, a wet stone exploded. Marit had been testing a dark cobble on the stove lip, a stone she had pulled from the creek bank that afternoon, a stone that looked dense and solid, but had sat in shallow water for months and held moisture deep in the grain. The stove was running at half draft, the patched crack holding, the firebox putting out steady heat. The stone sat on the lip for 12 minutes. Then it cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, and a shard the size of a thumb spun off the stove and caught Marit on the inside of her left wrist. The burn was immediate and deep, not a cut, a friction burn from a superheated stone fragment traveling fast enough to strip skin. Marit pressed her wrist against her apron and breathed through her teeth. Adella came from the bedding area where she had been checking the clay for cracks. She looked at the wrist. A raw stripe, 3 inches long, already blistering. "That stone was wet," Adella said. "I pulled it from the bank this afternoon." "And you put it on a hot stove without drying it. Moisture in stone is a bomb, Marit. Steam is nowhere to go. It splits the grain and throws pieces. Your wrist. Next time, your eye." "I tested it. It sounded solid." "It sounded solid because the water fills the voids that would ring hollow. A wet stone lies better than a dry one. Adella wrapped the burn with clean cotton soaked in tallow. Every stone from the creek sits in the air for 1 day before it goes on the stove. Every one. No exceptions. I do not have 1 day. Then you use the stones that are already dry, the ones you hauled yesterday, the ones sitting in the sun pile beside the door. You leave the wet ones for a second session after the front passes. If the front passes, then I am alive to have a second session. Adella tied the bandage. You will be alive. The floor is 3/4 done. 3/4 is enough to keep the center of this cabin above freezing through one night without fire. I have seen worse work hold heat. Marit looked at her. Have you seen worse work hold heat through a panhandle norther? Adella did not answer. That silence carried more weight than any verdict Abner had spoken. The fifth trip happened in darkness, by lantern light, with Pear walking the road from memory because the ruts were deep enough to guide him. Marit loaded 300 pounds, less than half a normal load, because the horse was done. His ribs showed sharper now, and he stood with his head low between the traces while Marit loaded, and he did not lift it when she climbed the wagon and clicked her tongue. He walked because the traces told him to walk. There was nothing left in him beyond obedience. The unexpected help came near midnight. Etta's 12-year-old nephew Bram appeared on the road with 2 ranch hands behind him. The men were young, barely 20, and they had the sheepish look of men arriving somewhere they had mocked that morning. One of them, a tall boy with sunburned ears, said his name was Mott. The other said nothing at all. They did not apologize. They hauled. Mott carried stones from the pile to the door. The quiet one carried stones from the door to the floor edge. Bram sorted the discard pile and found 3 good cobbles Marit had rejected earlier because she was tired and her judgment had slipped. Adella checked each one and confirmed them. In 90 minutes, the 4th section was half done. Mott and the quiet hand left before anyone else could see them. They walked south toward the ranch in the dark, and Marit never learned the quiet one's name. Bram stayed. He was too young to carry full stones, but he could sweep sand into joints and haul ash from the fire pit, and he worked with the focused energy of a boy who wanted to be useful and had finally found a way. Etta stood in the lantern light and watched her nephew work and said nothing about belief or doubt. By 3 a.m, the floor was done. Not beautiful, not even competent by any mason standard. Warped planks relayed on shallow sleepers with gaps near the stove where rising heat could reach the stone beneath. Gray ash visible in the board seams. The stove sitting on 2 iron scraps above the densest cluster of buried cobble, feet resting on metal so the heat would conduct straight down into the stone bed. 2 small vents cut near the hearth with Adella's hammer, angled to let warm air circulate beneath the boards. Marit's hands shook too badly to button her cuff. Adella made her eat beans, cold, because firing the stove before the last of the whetstones dried was foolish, and Adella did not tolerate foolish. Then Adella lit the stove at half draft with the driest cottonwood from the bottom of the pile, and they waited. Early data came in the only measurements a frontier cabin allowed. Marit set a pail of water on the old plank edge near the west wall, where boards covered bare crawl space she had not been able to reach. She set a second pail on the stone-packed center, 3 feet from the stove. After 2 hours of steady burn, the first pail had a skin of ice. The second was liquid and faintly warm to the touch. She scratched marks on the inside of the east wall with charcoal, floor cold side, floor stone side, stove time, water state. Abner would later see these marks and call them schoolhouse figuring, but they were the only proof she had, and proof mattered more than pride. The wind changed at noon the following day. It had blown from the southwest all morning, warm enough that Marit opened the door to air the cabin while the stove charged the stones. Then the wind stopped, completely. The silence was so abrupt that Pear lifted his head in the shed and the milk cow turned her face toward the north. Birds vanished from the creek willows. Marit had not noticed them until they were gone, the way you do not notice breathing until it stops. The sky went from pale blue to white to the color of a 2-day bruise, and the air tasted like metal. Adella stood in the doorway and watched the northern horizon. The shelf of cloud had dropped and thickened. It was no longer a shelf. It was a wall, low, dark, moving with visible speed across the flat grassland, swallowing the distance between the Canadian river breaks and Sweetwater Creek at a pace that made the stomach drop. "I have to go," Adella said. Marit turned from the stove where she had been feeding a careful, measured burn. Half-draft, good, dry cottonwood, the flames low and even. "Stay. Please." "Mrs. Harden is alone. She's 73 and her stove vents badly, and she will not leave the door open because she fears the dog will run." Adella pulled on her canvas jacket. "If I leave now, I reach her before the gale. If I wait, the road closes and she dies." "What if the floor does not hold?" Adella picked up her bundle. She left the mason's hammer on the table. "The floor will hold what it can. You built it right, Marit. The bedding is sound. The stones are dry and dense and properly seated. The break beneath will slow the loss." She paused at the door. "Do not chase flame. Feed the stones. Build your heat for 6 hours at steady draft. Then close the stove and let them speak. They will hold warmth longer than you think, and when you think they are done, put your hand on the floor and wait. Stone does not hurry." Marit followed her to the door. The first gust hit them, warm from the south, the last breath of the old air being pushed ahead of the front. Adella's skirt pressed flat against her legs. "The hammer stays," Adella said. "I will come for it when the road's open." She walked into the warm wind toward the settlement road. Marit watched her until the road bent south and the mesquite scrub hid her. Then she went inside and closed the door and fed the stove another split of cottonwood. She was alone. Bram had gone home with Etta an hour earlier. Abner was somewhere south with cattle. The nearest occupied cabin was Etta's, 4 miles away. The stove burned. The stones took heat. Marit sat on the bed and put her hand flat against the boards and felt the warmth rising through the planks from the stone beneath. It was not hot. It was the temperature of an animal's flank, blood warmth held and steady. Sleet started ticking against the window at 4:30. Small sounds at first, like someone flicking a fingernail against the glass, then harder, then a rattle that did not stop. The norther arrived as an assault on sound. The cabin walls popped at every nail. The joints between boards opened and closed as the temperature outside dropped and the wood contracted, and each pop was a sharp report like a knuckle cracking. The stovepipe hummed a low note when the wind found the seam where it passed through the roof, and the hum rose and fell with the gusts until it sounded like something living and breathing inside the walls. Marit had been feeding the stove for 5 hours at half draft. The cottonwood was more than half gone. She had started with less than a third of a cord, burned some before the floor was done, and now the pile against the wall was a thing she could count in individual splits. 14. 15 if she broke the knotted piece that would not fit the firebox. The wash basin froze, not slowly, not a skim of ice forming over time. Marit watched it happen. She had set the basin on the shelf near the north wall 10 minutes earlier, with water warm enough to wash her hands. When she reached for it again, the surface was solid. She pressed it with her thumb, and it cracked, but beneath the crack the water was thick and sluggish, already turning. She moved the basin to the center of the room, above the stone-packed floor. 30 minutes later the water was liquid again. The cow bellowed in the lean-to. Marit opened the side door and the cold hit her like a wall of water. The temperature had dropped so fast that the air felt solid, like pushing through something with physical weight. The cow's breath was a white plume that froze on her eyelashes and the hair around her muzzle. Marit threw a feed sack over the cow's back and closed the side door and stood with her shoulders pressed against it, breathing hard. At 8 o'clock, the stove back began to glow. The cracked rear plate, patched with Adella's clay and tallow compound, and the wired tin cover, showed a dull red line along the edge of the patch. The fire had been running at half draft for 6 hours, and the metal was approaching the temperature where the patch would fail. Marit could see it, a faint orange thread along the seam where the tin met the iron. She had to choose. Feed the fire hard enough to push more heat into the stones and risk the patch blowing, which would send smoke into the sealed cabin, or damp the fire, protect the patch, and hope the stones had taken enough heat to hold through the night. Adella's voice in her memory: do not chase flame. Marit opened the firebox and added 3 splits of cottonwood, the last full load the firebox would take. She opened the damper to full draft for 10 minutes. The fire roared, the stove glowed brighter. The stone floor drank heat through the iron scraps beneath the stove feet, and Marit could feel the boards warming under her boots as she stood near the center of the room. 10 minutes. Then she slid the damper to quarter draft and let the fire settle. The glow on the rear plate faded from orange to dull red to dark. The patch held. She would not fire the stove hard again. From this point forward, it was low burns and hope. At 10 o'clock, someone hit the door. Not knocked. Hit. An open palm against the planks, weak and unrhythmic, the sound of someone who had been using their fist and could no longer close their fingers. Marit lifted the latch. The wind nearly tore the door from her hand. Snow drove horizontal across the threshold. Not flakes, but fine dry powder that stung like sand. In the snow, a shape, small, on its knees. Bram. He was 12 years old, and he was on his knees on Marit's threshold, with his coat frozen stiff and his mittens solid as boards. His face was white except for his cheeks and nose, which were the color of raw meat. He could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, and no words came. Marit grabbed him by the coat and dragged him inside. The door fought her. The wind held it open, pouring cold into the cabin, erasing in seconds what the stove had spent hours building. She threw her shoulder against the planks and forced it shut and dropped the latch bar. Bram collapsed on the floor. Marit stripped his frozen mittens. His fingers were white and waxy. She did not rub them. Her mother had taught her that rubbing frozen skin destroyed the flesh beneath. She wrapped his hands in a dry cloth and pressed them against her own stomach, under her shirt, and held them there while the boy shook. She pulled him to the center of the room. The quilts were on the bed. She dragged them down and laid them over the stone-warmed boards and rolled Bram onto them. His shaking was violent, rhythmic, his whole body convulsing as the muscles tried to generate the heat his blood could no longer carry. She piled every blanket and quilt she owned on top of him and pressed her body against his back, trying to give him heat she could not afford to lose. Through the shaking, she got the story in fragments. He had gone after a calf. Etta's brother-in-law's calf, loose from the pen. He followed it north. The whiteout closed in, and he lost the road. He walked until he saw the light of Marit's stove through the window. He did not find the calf. The floor beneath the quilts was warm. Not hot, not like a stovetop, but a steady warmth that rose through the boards and into the blankets, and did not stop. Marit could feel it against her hip where she lay beside Bram. The stones, charged for 6 hours, were doing what Adella said they would do. They were speaking. Bram's shaking slowed. His fingers, pressed against Marit's stomach, began to bend again. He whimpered when the feeling returned, because the feeling returning to frozen fingers is worse than the numbness. "Stay on the center," Marit said. "Do not move to the edges." If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next will test everything Marit built, and the answer is not the one she expected. At midnight, she heard the second sound, not the wind, not the house popping, a voice. Human, but stripped of words by the gale, reduced to a raw, shapeless cry coming from the direction of the creek. Marit went to the window. She could see nothing. The snow was a white wall. The lantern light reached 2 feet past the glass and stopped. The voice came again, closer, from the fence line. She knew she should not open the door. Every time the door opened, the cabin lost heat that the dwindling stove could not replace. Bram was on the floor under quilts, warming slowly, alive because the stones held. If she opened the door and lost enough heat, the stones might not be enough for both of them. The voice came a third time, weaker. Marit tied a rope around her waist. She knotted the other end to the bed frame, which was bolted to the wall. She opened the door. The cold hit her and she staggered. The wind was a physical force, pressing her backward, filling her lungs with air so cold it felt like breathing broken glass. She could not see. She walked into the white with one hand on the rope and the other reaching ahead. She found him at the fence line, 30 feet from the door. Abner Rowe. On his side in the snow, curled around himself, his hat gone, his coat open. He had been trying to reach Etta's place from the cattle camp, and the whiteout had turned him. He was not conscious. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps that froze in his mustache. Marit could not carry him. He outweighed her by 60 pounds. She looped the rope under his arms and dragged him. 30 feet through knee-deep snow, the wind pushing her sideways, the rope cutting into her waist. She fell twice. The second time, her burned wrist hit the frozen ground, and the pain was so sharp that her vision went white. She got him to the threshold. She could not lift him over the sill. She braced her feet against the doorframe and pulled the rope with everything her body had left. And Abner's shoulders cleared the threshold, and she pulled again, and his hips cleared, and she pulled once more, and his boots came inside, and she threw herself against the door and latched it. The cabin was cold. She could feel it. The open door, twice, for a total of maybe 4 minutes. But 4 minutes of a panhandle norther's full force, and the heat the stove had stored in the air was gone. The stove was burning low. 3 splits of cottonwood left beside the wall. She fed one and opened the damper to half. The patch on the rear plate showed no glow. The fire caught, and the heat was thin. Bram lay on the center floor, under quilts, still shivering but breathing evenly. Marit dragged Abner to the near edge, where the planks covered bare crawl space. She piled her coat and a horse blanket over him. She watched. Bram, on the stone-packed center, gradually stopped shivering. His color returned, his breathing deepened. Abner, near the wall where the planks covered nothing but cold air, shook worse. His lips were blue. His breathing was ragged. Marit pulled Abner onto the center floor beside Bram. She rearranged the quilts to cover both of them. She pressed her hand to the boards. Still warm. Fainter now, but warm. Abner's eyes opened. He was not fully conscious, but he felt the floor beneath him. His hand moved, pressing flat against the boards the way Marit had pressed hers 100 times in the past 3 days. "Floor's warm," he muttered. The words were thick. His eyes closed again. The stove fire dropped to coals at 2 in the morning. Marit fed the second-to-last split. It caught poorly. The wood was knotted, sappy, and it smoked before it burned. The smoke backed into the room through the crack in the plate. Not much, enough to sting the eyes. Marit held a wet rag over her mouth and nursed the fire until the sap burned off and the flame steadied. At 3 in the morning, the fire died. The last split was green-tinged, poorly seasoned. Marit tried it, and it smoked so badly that the room filled in 2 minutes. She pulled it from the firebox and threw it out the side door into the snow. No fuel. Cold stove. Cold pipe. The cabin was sealed and dark except for the lantern, and the temperature inside was falling. This was the test. Not the stove. Not the fire. The stones. Marit lay down between Bram and Abner, on the center of the floor, on the quilts, and pressed her palms against the boards. Warm. Fainter now. A warmth that was more memory than fire, the stones giving back what the stove had given them, slowly, steadily, the way a cooling brick gives heat to a cold room long after the kiln has shut. The temperature inside the cabin dropped. She could feel it in the air on her face, on her ears, on the tip of her nose. The air was cold, but the floor was warm. Not hot, not comfortable. A warmth that kept the center of the room above the killing line, above the temperature where flesh stops working, where blood thickens, where a sleeping person does not wake. The water pail near the west wall froze solid. Marit heard it crack. She reached for the pail she had set on the stone-packed center that afternoon, a skin of ice on top. She pushed through it with her finger, liquid beneath. Hours passed. The wind did not stop. The cabin popped and creaked, and the stovepipe hummed its dead note. Marit lay awake with her hand flat on the boards, measuring by touch what she could not measure by instrument. Warm, fading, still warm, fading more, still above cold. Bram slept. His breathing was deep and even, a child's sleep, the body doing what it had been too frozen to do for hours. Abner breathed in long, rattling draws that worried Marit, but his color was better and his lips were no longer blue. Outside, the norther owned the world. Wind speeds that bent the mesquite flat. Snow that filled the wagon ruts and buried the fence posts and turned the landscape into a white blank where direction meant nothing and distance was a lie. In a line shack 3 miles east, one of Dempsey Cale's hired teamsters sat against a wall with his hands tucked inside his coat. The shack had plank floors over bare ground and a sheet iron stove burning green cottonwood that smoked so badly the man kept the door cracked for ventilation. The cracked door let the cold in. The green wood gave more smoke than heat. By morning, the teamster would lose 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite, the tips blackened and dead, curled inward like burned paper. That was 3 miles away, in a cabin built the same way as Marit's, with the same materials, by the same kind of men, in the same weather. The only difference was what lay beneath the floor. Gray light came at 7, not sunrise. The storm was too thick for sunrise, but the darkness thinned from black to gray, and Marit knew morning had come because the quality of the cold changed. The dropping was over. The temperature had hit bottom and was holding there, brutal but stable. She sat up. Her body ached in so many places that the individual pains had merged into a single whole-body throb. Her burned wrist had stuck to the bandage. Her hands were stiff. Her lower back felt like someone had driven a spike through it. She pressed her palm to the floor, warm, faint, a ghost of what it had been at midnight, but warm. 8 hours after the last fire, the stones beneath the board still held enough heat that Marit's palm could tell the difference between the center floor and the air above it. Abner opened his eyes. He looked at the frost on the walls, white and thick where moisture had condensed and frozen. He looked at the dark stove, the cold pipe, the empty wood stack. He looked at Bram sleeping beside him under quilts on a floor that should have been frozen solid. He pressed his hand against the boards. He held it there for a long time. "Mrs. Vangen," he said. His voice was rough. "What is under this floor?" "River stones," Marit said. 6,000 pounds, bedded on ash and clay and straw, charged by the stove for 6 hours before you arrived. Abner lay back and stared at the ceiling. The frost on the rafters was thick enough to scrape, but the air near the floor, where the quilts trapped the stone's diminishing warmth, was survivable. "I told you a floor would not save you," he said. "You were wrong." Abner closed his eyes. "I was wrong." Outside, the wind began to ease. The storm broke on the second morning. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan to silence over the span of an hour, and by noon the sky had torn open in ragged strips of blue between clouds moving fast toward the southeast. The temperature stayed brutal, cold enough that the puddles of snowmelt froze in place the moment the sun dipped behind a cloud. But the killing force was gone. Marit opened the door and looked at a world remade. Snow filled the wagon ruts to the axle height. The fence line was buried in drifts that ran east to west in long, smooth ridges shaped by the wind. The shed roof sagged where snow had piled against the north face, and one of the hen boxes had blown open. Both hens were dead, stiff on the straw, their feathers ruffled by a wind that no longer moved. 2 hens lost. The cow alive, standing in the lee of the shed with frost on her eyelashes and a look of dull patience. Purr was in the shed, breathing clouds, his water bucket frozen solid. Marit broke the ice with a stone, and he drank for 2 full minutes. Inside the cabin, Bram sat up under the quilts and asked for food. Abner was on his feet, moving slowly, his joints audible when he bent. He had not spoken since his admission that morning. He stood near the stove, cold, firebox empty, pipe dark, and looked at the floor. He knelt. He pressed his palm flat against the boards, the way Marit had done 100 times. His hand stayed there for 10 seconds. Then he moved to the edge where planks covered bare crawl space. He pressed his palm there. He moved back to the center, back and forth twice more, his face unreadable. "How long was the fire out?" he asked. 8 hours, maybe 9. Abner stood. He looked at the charcoal marks on the east wall, Marit's crude record of floor temperature, stove time, and water state. He studied them the way he would study a horse's legs before buying. "The boy was on this floor all night," Abner said. "No fire, and his fingers came back. His fingers came back because I got him to the center in time. The floor kept the center above freezing." Abner walked to the west wall where the water pail sat. Frozen solid, a block of white ice with the pail deformed around it. He walked back to the center pail, a skin of ice but liquid beneath, and the pail undamaged. "I need to tell Etta what happened here," he said. "Not a request, a statement of purpose. She needs to hear it from someone besides you, because you are the one who built it, and people will think you are selling something. She needs to hear it from me." He put on his coat and walked out. His boots broke through the snow crust with each step. He did not look back. Etta came that afternoon with her nephew's coat and a jar of preserved peaches, and a list of questions she had written on the back of a hymnal page. She had spoken to Abner. She had heard the facts. No fire after 3 in the morning, the boy alive, the water liquid at the center, the floor warm to the touch 8 hours after the last burn. She did not begin with questions. She began by kneeling on the floor the way Abner had, palms flat, moving from center to edge and back. Her face did the thing that Abner's had done. The recalculation, the reluctant revision of a verdict she had delivered with confidence 3 days earlier. "How warm was it at the worst hour?" Etta asked. "I do not know the temperature. I know the water did not freeze and the boy stopped shivering. You used less than a third of a cord. Less than that. The stove ran for 6 hours before the crisis, and maybe 2 hours during it. Say 5 or 6 splits over the full burn. Abner expected 2 full cords for a cabin this size through one bad norther." Etta wrote on the hymnal page. She was a school teacher. Numbers meant something to her. "You used perhaps 1/10 of what he calculated." "I used 1/10 to heat the stones. The stones did the rest." "For how long?" 8 hours without fire. The floor was still faintly warm at dawn. Etta sat on the bed. The jar of peaches was in her lap. She turned it in her hands the way a person turns an object when their mind is working on something else. "Abner said the teamster in Dempsey's line shack lost 2 fingers. Same storm, same night, same kind of cabin." "Same kind of cabin," Marit said, "without the floor." That distinction became the core of every conversation that followed. The cabin was the same. The stove was worse. Marit's was cracked and patched. The wood supply was smaller. The difference was 6,000 pounds of river stone, bedded on ash and clay, charged by 6 hours of steady fire. The floor did not stay warm. It stayed above the killing cold. And above the killing cold for long enough was the difference between 2 dead fingers and a living boy. Word spread the way it always spread in a scattered settlement, through riders, through wives, meeting at the store, through freighters who carried news alongside cargo. Bram's survival was the detail that traveled fastest, not the physics, not the stone, the boy. A 12-year-old who walked out of a norther alive because a widow's floor held heat after the fire died. That was a story people could carry in their mouths. They came within the week. First, a rancher's wife from south of the creek, a German woman named Ilse Brandt, who had lost a milk cow in the storm and wanted to know if the method worked for sheds. Marit told her it worked for any enclosed space with a stove, but a shed without a stove had no way to charge the stones. The woman left dissatisfied, wanting a miracle that did not require fire. Then a man named Connolly, Irish, who ran a small outfit east of Mobiti and had spent the norther in his cabin burning furniture after his woodpile ran out. He came with his 14-year-old daughter and stood in Marit's cabin and pressed his palm to the floor and said nothing for a full minute. His daughter asked how the stones were chosen. Marit handed her the mason's hammer and showed her the tap test, and the girl struck 6 stones and correctly identified the 2 good ones without being told. Marit did not sell the method. She did not charge. She showed people how to test stones, the tap, the listen, the discard. She showed them the ash and clay bed, the straw mixed in, the 1-inch minimum beneath the stones. She showed them the iron scraps under the stove feet, and the narrow gaps cut in the boards near the hearth. She answered questions with the patience of a person who had been doubted and had survived and no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. But she corrected mistakes with an edge she had learned from Adella. When Connolly asked if round stones would work as well as flat ones, Marit said no. Round stones shift, and the gaps between them leak air upward through the bed. When Ilse Brandt returned a week later and said she planned to use stones from a collapsed chimney, Marit asked whether the chimney had been mortared with lime. It had. Marit told her to scrub the lime off, or it would powder under heat and the bed would crack. The correction was specific, practical, and delivered without gentleness. Dempsey Cale heard about the visitors the way he heard about everything, through the freight network, through the store, through the riders who owed him money or favors. His reaction was not conversion, it was recalculation. He appeared at Rath's store on a Saturday when 3 men and 2 women had gathered to ask questions about the stone floor method. He stood at the counter and listened and said nothing until the group was leaving. Then he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Mrs. Vangen's floor is a curiosity. It held heat one night in one cabin during one storm. That is not a method. That is luck built on a dead husband's lumber. The room went quiet. Marit was not present. She was at the cabin, mixing a fresh ash bed for a corner section that had settled unevenly. But the words reached her through Etta before sundown, and they stung in the way that only a truth twisted into a weapon can sting. Anders had built the cabin. Anders had laid the hearthstone she first tested. The work was hers, but the foundation was his, and Dempsey knew that invoking the dead husband would make the work seem borrowed rather than built. It was Abner who answered 3 days later in the same store to a different group. He did not defend Marit. He described what he saw. I lay on that floor with no fire for 8 hours in the worst norther I have seen in 20 years. The boy lay beside me. The boy lived. The floor was warm at dawn. I have been on this plane long enough to know what kills people, and I am telling you that floor changed the math. He said it once. He did not repeat it. Abner Rowe was not a man who repeated himself, and the fact that he said it at all carried more weight than a dozen testimonials. Adella returned when the roads opened 5 days after the storm. She walked to the cabin with the bundle on her shoulder and found Marit teaching Connolly's daughter how to mix the ash-clay straw bed in the correct proportions. Adella stood in the doorway and watched for 10 minutes without announcing herself. When the girl left, Adella came inside and inspected the floor. She got on her knees and checked the settled corner, pressing each stone with her thumb, testing the bed with the back of a kitchen knife slid between the boards. She found 2 stones that had shifted a 1/4 inch during the storm. The thermal expansion and contraction of the freeze-thaw cycle had worked them loose. Reset these, Adella said. Pull them, retamp the bed, reseat them tight. If they shift once, they shift again, and each shift opens a gap that lets cold air through. I was going to fix them this week. You were going to teach the Connolly girl this week and fix them when you had time. Fix them first. Teaching a method you have not maintained is teaching a lie. The rebuke was sharp, and Marit took it without argument. She pulled the 2 stones, scooped the bed, remixed, retamped, and reseated them in 40 minutes. Adella watched the whole process and corrected nothing, which meant it was done right. That afternoon, they built a second floor together, not in Marit's cabin, in Etta's. Etta had asked, not because she fully believed, but because the norther had cost her a window shutter, a frozen pipe, and 2 nights of sleepless fear while Bram was missing, and she was unwilling to face the next storm with only wood between her family and the cold. Etta's cabin was smaller than Marit's, 8 feet by 10 in the main room, and the stove was better, a proper cast iron box with no cracks and a good draft. The floor was plank over sleepers, similar construction, similar crawl space. They worked for 2 days. The collaboration revealed the depth of Adella's knowledge. She adjusted the method for Etta's cabin in ways Marit had not considered. Smaller stones near the edges, where foot traffic was lighter and the weight would not shift the sleepers. Flatter stones near the stove, where the heat concentration was greatest and uneven surfaces would rock underfoot. A deeper ash break along the north wall, where ground frost penetrated most aggressively. Removable planks over the hearth section for cleaning grit and resetting stones without pulling the entire floor. Marit watched and learned, and for the first time, disagreed. The disagreement was over the vent gaps. Marit had cut 2 narrow vents in her own floor near the stove to let warm air circulate from the stone bed upward through the boards. Adella wanted 3 vents in Edda's floor. Marit argued that 3 vents in a smaller cabin would let too much heat escape upward too fast, draining the stones before the long night hours when the heat was needed most. 2 vents, with cloth covers to close them after midnight, Marit said. 3 vents, open. The stone bed in a cabin this small will overheat near the stove and stay cold at the edges. The 3rd vent pulls warm air from the center and moves it toward the north wall. Or it pulls the warmth out of the stones and wastes it in the air, where it rises and leaves through the roof. Adella looked at her. The look was not anger, it was assessment. She was measuring whether Marit's objection came from understanding or from the need to be right. Build it with 2, Adella said. If the north edge stays cold, you add the 3rd, and you tell me I was right. They built it with 2. The north edge stayed cold during the first test burn. Marit added the 3rd vent the following morning and told Adella she was right. Adella said nothing, which was her way of saying she already knew. In the evenings, after the stonework was done, Adella talked. Not teaching. Talking. About her father, Esteban Carvajal, who had built stone walls near San Elizario before the war, who had learned from Mexican masons, who had learned from mission builders, who had understood thermal mass 2 centuries before anyone on the Texas plains thought to use it. About the spring house he built that kept butter cold in summer and water liquid in winter. About the army ovens at Fort Davis that held bread heat for hours after the fire was pulled. My father did not invent anything, Adella said. He remembered. Stone and heat are old knowledge. People forget it when lumber gets cheap and stoves get easy. But the ground does not forget. Heat goes into stone and stone gives it back. That is not invention. That is listening. Marit asked about Adella's husband. He had died at Fort Davis. Typhus. Adella had washed his sheets and buried his clothes and walked to Fort Elliott with a letter of introduction from the post surgeon because she had nowhere else to go. She washed laundry for 9 years. She cooked for officer families. She raised no children of her own. She kept her father's hammer the way Marit kept her mother's Bible, as proof that someone had lived and known things and passed them forward. There was a resonance between them that neither woman named, both widowed, both surviving on knowledge and labor, both dismissed by men who measured capability in muscle and property. Adella was harder than Marit, decades harder, worn smooth the way creek stones were worn smooth by constant pressure from all directions. Marit was newer to the wearing, but the grain was the same. Adella's cough started the 2nd week after the storm, a deep, wet sound that came from the base of her lungs and left her bent at the waist with her hands on her knees. Years of cold water laundry, years of lye and ash and steam in poorly ventilated rooms, years of army post winters in barracks that were warmer than homesteader cabins, but still brutal on a body that worked in water. The lungs were damaged. The cold had deepened the damage. She did not stop working. She mixed ash beds and tested stones and corrected Marit's teaching and argued about vent placement with the stubbornness of a woman who had been right more often than she had been listened to. But the cough got worse. By the 3rd week, she could not carry the ash sack from the fire pit to the cabin without stopping twice to breathe. Marit asked her to rest. I rest when the work is done. The work is never done. You taught me that. Adella looked at her from across the room. The mason's hammer was on the table between them. The cough came again, 3 hard barks that left Adella's eyes watering and her lips pressed tight. I have a cousin near San Antonio, Adella said. She has a warm house, a low house near the river, with thick walls and a fireplace that draws clean. The air is different there. Wet, warm, good for lungs. When would you go? Before the next front. A man named Garza runs a freight wagon south twice a month. He owes me a favor from Fort Elliott. The departure happened on a Tuesday morning that was bright and cold and still. Adella packed her bundle, the canvas, the pliers, the clay knife, a change of clothes. She left the mason's hammer on Marit's table. "That is yours," Marit said. "It was my father's. Now it belongs to the woman who uses it. I will keep it for you. You will use it." That is the difference between keeping and honoring. Adella stood in the doorway. Behind her, the panhandle stretched flat and winter brown toward a horizon so distant it curved. The sky was the hard blue of cold weather without wind, and the light lay flat across the grass like something poured. "Never let a man sell people what the ground gave them," Adella said. "The stone is free. The ash is free. The clay is free. The knowledge is free. The moment someone puts a price on it, they have stolen it from the earth and from the people who remembered it." She walked to the road where Garza's freight wagon waited. Marit watched her climb the bench seat with the bundle on her lap, and the wagon rolled south, and the dust settled, and the road was empty. Marit stood in the doorway of a cabin that held heat in its floor and silence in its rooms. The mason's hammer sat on the table where Adella had placed it, hickory shaft smooth from decades of hands, the head darkened by use. 2 women had held it, Adella, who learned from her father, and now Marit, who would learn from its weight in her palm what no words could teach. The knowledge was in the grip. The knowledge was in the strike. Spring came like a held breath released. The snow melted in stages, first from the south-facing slopes, then from the flats, then from the sheltered draws where drifts had packed hard and deep. Sweetwater Creek rose. The water went from ankle-deep to knee-deep to waist-deep in the ford where Marit had hauled stones, and the gravel bar where the best cobbles lay disappeared under brown water carrying silt and branches, and the occasional fence post torn from its hole. Marit taught through the warming weeks. Connolly's daughter brought 2 families from east of Mobeetie. Abner sent a rancher named Wick who had lost a hired hand to exposure in a line shack and wanted the floors improved before the next winter. Etta hosted a Sunday gathering at the schoolhouse where Marit demonstrated the tap test, the ash bed recipe, and the vent placement. 14 people attended. 12 stayed through the full demonstration. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before their own weather changes. The teaching carried its own risks. A man named Foote, impatient and thick-armed, placed damp stones against a hot stove in his own cabin, and one cracked and threw a shard that cut his daughter's forearm. The girl was not badly hurt, a shallow slice, stitched by Etta with cotton thread, but the incident gave Dempsey Cale ammunition. Dempsey told the story at Rath's store with embellishments. The widow was teaching people to put bombs in their floors. The widow was filling cabins with river stones that exploded near fire. The method was reckless woman's masonry, untested and dangerous, and the next child injured might not be so lucky. The accusation landed because it had a kernel of truth lodged inside the distortion. Foote had used damp stones. Marit had not taught him. He had heard the method secondhand and tried it without testing or drying. But the injury was real, and a real injury was worth more to Dempsey than 100 arguments about proper technique. Marit took the blame publicly. She stood in Etta's schoolhouse the following Sunday and said she should have made the drying rule louder and the warnings harder to miss. Every stone pulled from water or damp ground must spend 2 full days in dry air before it goes near heat. Every stone. No exceptions. She said it 3 times, and then she made every person in the room pick up a stone from the demonstration pile and tell her whether it was dry. 4 of the 14 guessed wrong. She corrected each one. Then the spring flood came, and with it a late cold snap that turned the melting landscape into a crusted, frozen mess. Creek water overran the banks and soaked the lower ground where 3 families had cabins. Bedding ruined, firewood wet, stoves cold because the wood would not catch, and the matches were damp, and the kindling had been stored at ground level where the water found it. 3 families came to the schoolhouse because Etta opened it. The schoolhouse was higher ground, a plank building with a good stove and a roof that did not leak, but it had no stone floor. The plank boards over bare earth let cold rise the way Marit's cabin had before she tore the floor up. Adella was gone. Abner was away, driving cattle south toward better grass. Dempsey refused to lend wagons to haul stones unless the families signed debt notes for future freight service. The offer was extortion dressed as generosity, and the three families stood in the cold schoolhouse and looked at Marit and said nothing because they did not know what else to do. Marit looked at the schoolhouse stove, then at the floor, then at the collapsed chimney behind the building where Etta had stacked the old stones after the chimney came down 2 winters ago. Dry stones. Chimney stones, fire-tested, already proven to hold heat because they had spent years doing exactly that inside a working flue. She pulled the planks from the center of the schoolhouse floor. The people watched. Some helped. Some stood back. Without Adella, the work was slower and less certain. Marit mixed the ash bed from the schoolhouse stove and clay she dug from the yard, but she did not have chopped straw and had to use dried grass pulled from the field, which was coarser and packed less evenly. She tested each chimney stone with the mason's hammer and discarded 4 that rang hollow. She set the rest on a tamped bed that was rougher than the one in her cabin, but serviceable. She made mistakes Adella would have caught. One section of the bed was too thin, half an inch instead of a full inch, and she caught it herself only after laying 3 stones and feeling the cold still bleeding upward through the gaps. She pulled the stones, redug the bed, added more ash, retamped, and relaid. The correction cost an hour. The 3 families watched her undo her own work and redo it, and the watching taught them more than any demonstration because it showed that the method required honesty. If the bed was wrong, you pulled it. You did not build on a lie. By nightfall, the center of the schoolhouse had a stone floor, crude, smaller than Marit's, but the stove was better and the chimney stones were already seasoned, and when the fire ran for 4 hours at steady draft, the floor held warmth that lasted through the night while 3 families slept on quilts over warm boards, and the creek water froze in the yard outside. Dempsey's response to the schoolhouse floor was silence, which was more dangerous than mockery. Silence from Dempsey Cale meant planning. He still held Marit's stove note. He still wanted the creek frontage. The method's success did not make him an ally. It made him a man whose original plan had failed and who needed a new one. Abner returned from the cattle drive and heard about the schoolhouse from Etta. He came to Marit's cabin on a warm afternoon in April, when the grass was starting to green and the creek had dropped back to its banks. "Dempsey is telling people you're a danger," Abner said. "The footgirl's arm. The schoolhouse floor done without proper training. He is building a case." "A case for what?" "To have the justice rule your method a public hazard. If the justice agrees, Dempsey can block you from teaching. And if he blocks you from teaching, the only person offering stone floors is Dempsey himself, at whatever price he sets. The method is free." "Free things are the easiest to steal, Mrs. Vangen. All you need is a man with a stamp and a counter-argument." Marit looked at the mason's hammer on the table, Adella's voice in her memory. "Never let a man sell people what the ground gave them." "Then I teach faster," Marit said. "I teach everyone who will listen, and I teach them well enough that they do not need me or Dempsey. If the knowledge is in 40 cabins instead of 1, no justice can unknow it." Abner studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Marit's stove note, $5.50, due January 1st, now 3 months past due." "Where did you get that?" Marit asked. "Paid it. Families you helped took a collection. Connolly, Etta, the Brandt woman, Wick. 14 people put in what they could. Some gave 50 cents, some gave $1. It added to $5.60. I gave the note and the money to Dempsey yesterday. He did not want to take it. I told him the alternative was Wick and Connolly and me standing in the justice's office explaining that a creditor was using a $5 note to steal a widow's property and suppress a method that saved a child's life." Marit held the paper. The signature was Anders's. The cramped, careful letters of a man who had learned English writing late and never trusted his hand to move fast. $5.50. the weight that had hung over every decision since the funeral, the lever Dempsey had used to threaten the horse, the cabin, the stove, and the future. Paid, by people whose floors she had warmed. She folded the note and put it in the Bible beside her mother's pressed flour from Valdra's. Then she picked up the mason's hammer and walked to the shed where a pile of unsorted creek stones waited for the next person who came to learn. By autumn of 1887, Marit Vangen ran a preparation circle out of Etta's schoolhouse every Saturday afternoon. The routine was fixed and practical. Stone testing, stove patching, ash screening, floor gap checks, and emergency bedding. People arrived with stones they had collected during the week, carried in wagon beds and feed sacks and apron folds, and Marit tested each one with the mason's hammer and a tap against the threshold stone. She taught them to listen. A bright ring meant a liar, a stone with hidden fissures or moisture pockets that would crack under heat. A dull, tight sound meant a keeper, dense, dry, honest. The circle drew between 8 and 20 people, depending on the weather and the distance, and how recently someone had been frightened by a cold night. Ranch hands came alongside their wives. A circuit-riding preacher named Moss attended twice and asked whether the method could be taught to congregations along his route through the breaks. Marit told him the method could be taught to anyone who would listen for an hour and carry stones for a day. He asked whether she wanted credit. She said credit was for people selling something. She taught the way Adella had taught her, through action, through correction, through the blunt refusal to let poor work stand because feelings mattered more than function. When a man named Stell placed a row of stones with visible gaps wide enough to fit a finger, Marit pulled the entire row and made him retamp the bed while the rest of the circle watched. Stell's ears burned red, but the next row was tight, and when his wife came to the following session, she told Marit that Stell had relayed his entire north section at home because the gaps bothered him in his sleep. When Ilse Brandt mixed an ash bed with green grass instead of dry, Marit crumbled the mix in her hand and showed everyone the moisture that wept from the stems. Green grass rots under heat and the bed collapses. Dry grass holds air pockets that slow heat loss. The difference between the two was the difference between a floor that worked and a floor that settled into a cold, uneven mess by midwinter. Not everyone accepted instruction from a widow. A cattleman named Pruitt, broad and weathered and accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them, told Marit her ash ratio was wrong because he had built lime kilns and understood heat better than a woman who had learned from a laundress. Marit asked him what temperature lime calcined at. Pruitt did not know the number. Marit said, "Higher than any cabin stove will ever reach. Your kiln knowledge does not apply here. The ash ratio is correct." Pruitt left and did not return. His cabin froze solid the following January, and his wife walked 4 miles to Etta's schoolhouse to learn the method herself. She did not mention her husband. Marit did not ask. The full-scale operation looked like this. On a typical Saturday, Marit arrived at the schoolhouse with the mason's hammer, a sack of sifted ash, and a bucket of premixed clay and straw for demonstration. She laid a 2-foot square sample bed on a board and invited people to press it, feel its density, and compare it to bare dirt. She demonstrated the stone tap test on 6 stones, 3 good, 3 bad, and made every newcomer identify which was which before they touched a trowel. She drew the cross-section of a proper floor on Etta's chalkboard. Frozen ground, 1-inch ash clay straw break, 4 inches of dense stone, sand and ash in the gaps, boards on shallow sleepers, vent gaps near the stove. Then she answered questions until the light failed. The questions revealed how far the knowledge had spread and how much distortion had crept in through secondhand telling. One woman from the breaks had heard that any stone would work if you heated it long enough. Wrong. Porous stone holds moisture and cracks, and no amount of heating fixes a stone that lies about its grain. A man from north of the Canadian had been told to lay stone directly on frozen ground and pile ash on top. Wrong. The break goes beneath the stone, not above it, because the break slows heat loss downward into the earth. Another man, young, recently arrived from Missouri with a wife and infant, had been told by a freighter that the floor replaced the need for firewood altogether. Marit corrected him sharply. The floor extended fuel. It did not replace it. A cabin with a stone floor and no wood still froze. A cabin with a stone floor and half the normal wood supply could survive twice as long. Confuse the two, she said, and you will trust the floor when you should have been cutting wood, and the floor will not save you from that kind of mistake. Each correction was a small defense against the entropy of second-hand knowledge. Adella had warned her, teach limits, not miracles. The distinction was the foundation of everything Marit taught, and she repeated it until people could say it back to her without prompting. The floor was not magic. The floor was patience stored in stone. Dempsey Cale had been quiet since the stove note was paid. Quiet from Dempsey was not peace. It was preparation. He had lost his leverage over Marit. He had lost the public argument about the method's danger after the foot girl's injury faded from memory and no further incidents followed. He had lost the respect of the men who once laughed when he mocked the widow and her stones. But he still had his storehouse, his freight contracts, and his pride. And pride on the panhandle was a currency that men spent recklessly and hoarded desperately. Through the autumn, he said nothing about stone floors. He bought his winter wood supply early, 3 full cords of seasoned oak hauled from the breaks at considerable expense, and stacked it with visible precision beside his storehouse, as if the height of the woodpile were an argument against the need for stone. His storehouse floor was plank over bare ground, well-built, tight-jointed, and utterly conventional. He had refused the method publicly and repeatedly. He called it widow's masonry. He said it was a curiosity that worked once in one cabin during one storm and would prove its limits soon enough. The second norther of that winter arrived in late January of 1888. It was not as severe as the first. The temperature dropped fast but not as far, and the wind blew hard but not as long. But it was enough to test every cabin in the Sweetwater Creek settlement, and every cabin responded according to what lay beneath its floor. Dempsey sheltered his freight goods in his storehouse. The walls were thick, the roof was sound. The sheet iron stove was new, properly vented, and drawing clean. 3 full cords of seasoned oak stood stacked beside the door. By every conventional measure, Dempsey Cale was the best prepared man in the settlement. The norther hit at sundown. The first hours were fine. The stove roared. The storehouse warmed. Dempsey sat at his desk with his account books and a glass of whiskey, and the satisfaction of a man who had wagered on tradition and believed tradition would hold. By midnight, the satisfaction was gone. The stove consumed oak at a rate that alarmed even Dempsey, because the floor pulled cold upward through every gap and seam, and the heat the stove poured into the air rose to the ceiling and leaked through the roof boards, and the cycle demanded more fuel to keep the room above discomfort. His 2 hired teamsters, men who slept on cots in the back room near the freight stacks, moved their bedding to the front room near the stove, because the back room had become so cold that their breath fogged and their water bucket froze. By 2 in the morning, the front room was losing ground. The stove burned hard, and the floor fought it. Dempsey fed another split of oak and felt the heat leave through the planks, as if the ground beneath were drinking it. One of the teamsters said the word that Dempsey did not want to hear: schoolhouse. By 4 in the morning, the men left. They walked through the storm to Etta's schoolhouse, a quarter-mile east, where the stone floor Merritt had built during the spring crisis still held. The schoolhouse stove was burning at half draft, not full, because the stone beneath the boards held heat the way a river stone holds the sun's warmth on a summer evening, and the stove did not need to fight the floor. 3 families were already there, sleeping on quilts over boards that radiated the steady, patient heat of charged stone. Dempsey held out until dawn. He came to the schoolhouse carrying his account books in a leather satchel and a crate of medicine bottles he could not afford to let freeze. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the families on the floor, the stove burning low, the warm boards, the calm that only people who are not afraid of the cold can carry on their faces. And he said nothing for a long time. Marit was awake. She had been awake all night, tending the stove, checking the vents, watching the stone bed perform the way it had performed every time since the first norther. She saw Dempsey in the doorway. His coat was buttoned wrong. His hat was crooked. He looked smaller than she remembered, the way powerful men look smaller when the thing they relied on has failed them in front of everyone. She did not speak first. Dempsey set the crate down. He removed his hat. The gesture was not courtesy. It was surrender, performed in front of every person who had ever heard him dismiss the floor as madness, and the widow as grief-stricken, and the method as reckless woman's masonry. "Mrs. Vangen," he said, "what would it cost to have my store floor done?" The room was quiet. The stove ticked as metal expanded. Wind pressed against the schoolhouse walls. Every person in the room was awake and listening, even the ones who pretended to sleep, because the sound of Dempsey Cal asking Marit Vangen for help was a sound that the Sweetwater Creek settlement had been waiting to hear without knowing it. "Ask the people you tried to charge," Marit said. The laughter was not cruel. It was the sound of a weight shifting, a balance tipping, a community recognizing that the person who had held power through debt and freight contracts and the threat of the justice's stamp had walked into a room warmed by the thing he had tried to kill. Dempsey stood in the laughter and absorbed it the way a man absorbs a blow he knows he earned. He did not become kind. He did not apologize. He paid Connolly's son and two of Wick's ranch hands to haul stone and lay the bed in his storehouse the following week, and he paid Marit nothing, and he never spoke of the night he came to the schoolhouse with his hat in his hand. But he stopped calling it widow's masonry. He stopped threatening the justice. He stopped trying to sell what Marit gave away. That was not redemption. It was defeat. And defeat on the Panhandle was close enough to justice that people accepted it and moved on. Orrin Vale came to Marit's cabin in March of 1888 because her wagon wheel was broken again. The same wheel, the same axle point, the same crack that the Mobeedy blacksmith had repaired after Anders died. The repair had held through the hauling season, through dozens of creek trips loaded with stone, through frozen ruts and mud holes, and the daily wear of a wagon that worked harder than any wagon its size should have worked. But the weld was tired, and the iron had fatigued, and the crack reopened on a Tuesday morning when Marit was hauling ash from a burn pile east of the cabin. Orrin was 38, a blacksmith and wagon repairman who had set up a forge near Mobeedy after the fort closed and the army trade dried up. He was not tall. He was not loud. He had the build of a man who had spent 20 years swinging a hammer, thick forearms, broad hands, a stillness in his posture that came from work that required patience and heat, and the knowledge of when metal was ready to move. He came because Etta sent him. Etta had been sending various helpful men toward Marit's cabin for months, with the transparent motive of a woman who believed widows should not remain widows past a certain point. Marit had ignored a carpenter, declined a freighter's dinner invitation, and been politely cold to a rancher who brought a side of beef and an expectation that the beef would purchase conversation. Orrin arrived with a portable forge kit, a replacement axle band, and no expectations at all. He looked at the wheel. He looked at the old weld. He said, "This was done hot and fast. The metal did not have time to marry. I can fix it, but the fix takes 2 hours because I have to draw the band down and reseat it slowly." 2 hours is fine. He worked. Marit watched for 10 minutes, long enough to see that he handled metal the way she handled stone, with the attention of someone who knew the material could punish carelessness, then went back to sorting stones for a floor she was building in Connolly's daughter's new cabin. When she came back an hour later, Orrin had the wheel off and the band drawn, and was heating the replacement on the fire pit coals. He had also, without being asked, examined the stovepipe where it passed through the roof, and bent 2 flashing clips that had worked loose in the wind. "Your flashing was leaking," he said. "Rain would have come through by April." "Thank you." "The stoveplate patch is holding well. Who did it?" "A woman named Adella Carvajal. She knew her trade. That wire work is Army field repair. Good for a season. After that, you need a proper plate or a new stove." He tapped the rear plate with a knuckle and listened the way Marit listened to stones. The sound was dull where the metal was thick and bright where the crack had been patched, and Orrin mapped the damage with his ear, the same way Marit mapped stone quality with hers. Watching him listen was the first moment she felt something shift. Not attraction, recognition. The feeling of seeing someone work in a way she understood because the principle was the same even if the material was different. "I can forge a replacement plate," he said. "I have iron stock. It would take a day." What would it cost? I owe Etta 2 shoeing jobs. She said if I fixed your wagon, we are even. The stoveplate is extra. Call it $3. I do not have $3 right now. Then call it a favor owed. I will collect when you have work for a blacksmith. The favor was collected 6 weeks later, when Merritt asked Orrin to forge 4 low-iron trivets for cabins that were building stone floors. The trivets replaced the improvised iron scraps she had been using under stove feet. Ugly, uneven pieces that shifted when the stove was loaded and sometimes let the stove tilt dangerously. Orrin's trivets were flat, stable, 3-legged for balance on uneven stone, and sized to fit the standard box stoves that most settlers used. He forged them in an afternoon and delivered them himself. The courtship happened over shared labor, not over dinners or Sunday walks or the polite rituals that most couples performed. Orrin returned to repair a hinge on Marit's shed door and stayed to help haul a load of stone for the Brandt cabin. They argued about stove clearances. How far from a stone floor should a stove sit to maximize heat transfer without scorching the boards? Orrin said 4 inches. Marit said 3. They tested both in separate cabins and found that 3.5 was right because the boards at 3 inches scorched after a full day burn, and the heat at 4 inches dissipated too widely before reaching the stone beneath. The discovery pleased them both more than either admitted. They argued about whether a hinge should lift or slide on a removable hearth plank. Orrin favored a lift hinge because it cleared the board entirely and allowed full access to the stone beneath for cleaning and resetting. Marit favored a sliding track because it kept the board close to the floor and reduced the heat gap. They built one of each in different cabins and asked the owners which worked better after a full winter. The sliding track won. Orrin accepted the result without complaint, which Marit noted with more interest than the result itself. He asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in September while they were measuring stove clearances in a new cabin being built by a family from the Breaks. Marit was on her knees with a measuring stick marked in inches. Orrin was holding the stove in place while she marked the floor. I would like to marry you, he said. You are holding a stove. I can hold a stove and propose at the same time. Marit looked at the measurement stick. 3.5 inches. She looked at Orrin. His arms were steady under the stove's weight. His face was the same face it always was, calm, patient, unhurried. The cabin and the method stay mine, she said. I did not ask for the cabin or the method. I asked for you. Then yes. They married in November of 1888 at the schoolhouse, with Etta as witness and Abner standing in the back row with his hat on his knee. Bram, now 13, carried the rings in his shirt pocket. The preacher Moss conducted the service. The schoolhouse floor was warm beneath everyone's feet, and Marit stood at the front of the room in a dress Etta had altered from her own wedding clothes, and Orrin stood beside her in a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of forge smoke, because the smell never fully left his skin. After the ceremony, Connolly's daughter brought a cake made with hoarded sugar, and Ilse Brandt brought a jar of blackberry preserves from a bush that grew along the creek, and Abner produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for an occasion he had not expected to see. He raised the glass and said, "To Mrs. Vangen, who outlasted my advice." It was the closest to an apology he would ever come, and Merritt took it as such. Orrin moved into the cabin with his forge tools and his anvil and nothing else. He did not rearrange. He did not suggest improvements to the layout. He hung his coat on the peg Anders had mounted beside the door and set his boots where Anders's boots had once stood, and the overlap was neither painful nor erased. It was simply the next layer of a life lived in the same small space, the way stone layers over stone. The first year of the marriage was a negotiation conducted through labor rather than words. Orrin built a proper forge shed behind the cabin, open on the south side for ventilation, with a stone floor beneath the anvil stand because Marit insisted, and because Orrin, having seen what heated stone did for a cabin, was curious what it would do for a forge. The answer was that the forge floor held warmth on cold mornings long enough for Orrin to start work without losing 30 minutes heating the space, and he admitted this was useful in the same understated way he admitted everything. A nod, a grunt, a slight adjustment to the corner of his mouth that served as his version of enthusiasm. They disagreed about the cabin stove. Orrin wanted to replace it entirely with a larger model he could forge from heavier plate. Marit wanted to keep the original, the same cracked, patched, twice-repaired stove that Anders had signed a note for, and Dempsey had used as leverage, and Adella had patched with Army field repair. The stove was inefficient and small, and carried the history of everything that had happened in the cabin since the beginning. Orrin said history did not heat a room. Marit said the room was already heated by the floor, and the stove only needed to charge the stones, and the stones did not care whether the stove was new or old. Orrin forged a new rear plate for the old stove. He replaced the patch section with solid iron, seated perfectly, and welded the seams with a patience that the Mobeetie blacksmith had never bothered with. The stove ran cleaner after that. The draft pulled true. Adella's wire and tallow patch went into a box on the shelf beside the Bible, kept the way a person keeps a letter that mattered, not for use, but for proof that someone had once done difficult work with insufficient materials and made it hold. Merritt ran the preparation circle every autumn. Orrin attended the sessions and built what the sessions required: trivets, vent covers, stove plates, iron scraps cut to size for understove feet. The ironwork became as much a part of the method as the stone and the ash, and people began asking for Orrin's trivets by name because the three-legged design sat level on uneven stone and did not shift when the stove was loaded. In 1891, 2 children arrived at the cabin and did not leave. A ranch family named Dahl, Norwegian by descent like Marit, had been struck by diphtheria that autumn. The father died first, then the mother 3 days later. The children, a boy of 7 named Colum and a girl of 9 named Petra, were brought to Edda's schoolhouse by a neighbor who could not keep them and did not know who could. Marit took them for the winter. The cabin was small for 4 people, but the floor was warm and the stoveplate was new, and Orrin had added a sleeping loft above the main room where the children could lie on straw ticks and feel the heat rising from below. Colum was quiet and did not speak for the first 3 weeks. Petra spoke enough for both. She asked Marit about every stone in the floor, every mark on the wall, every tool on the table. She picked up the mason's hammer on her second day and struck a stone against the threshold without being shown, and the sound was a dead, tight thud. A keeper. Marit looked at Orrin. Orrin looked at the girl. Neither of them said anything about the children staying, and neither of them needed to. The winter passed, and the spring came, and the children were still there, and by the second autumn Petra could test stones faster than most adults, and Colum was learning the forge, standing on a crate to reach the anvil, drawing his first stoveplate at 12 with hands that were small but accurate. Adella wrote once from San Antonio. The letter arrived in the spring of 1889, carried by Garza's freight wagon on its return route north. The handwriting was careful and small, the letters pressed deep into the paper by a hand that was weaker than it had been. The lungs were better in the warm air. The cousin's house had thick walls and a fireplace that drew clean. Adella asked whether the hammer was being used or kept. Marit wrote back on the same day. Used. Every Saturday. Petra is learning the tap. She has your ear for stone. Adella died in 1893. The letter from the cousin arrived 4 months after the death, carried on a slow route through freight relays and mail stages that still connected San Antonio to the Panhandle by patience rather than speed. The cousin wrote that Adella had been buried near her husband's grave, which had been moved from Fort Davis at government expense. She wrote that Adella's last coherent words, spoken to a nurse who did not understand them, were about the temperature of a stone wall in winter and how long it held warmth after the fire went out. Marit read the letter at the table where the mason's hammer lay. She picked up the hammer and held it in both hands. The hickory shaft was worn to the color of dark honey from decades of grip. Esteban's hands, then Adella's, then Marit's, and soon Petra's. She hung it on a nail beside the stove where she could see it every morning when she lit the fire, and it stayed there for the rest of her life. When people asked about it, she told them it belonged to a woman whose father built stone walls and whose daughter built stone floors, and the hammer was the proof that knowledge could pass through hands without losing its weight. The railroad came through the Panhandle in the early 90s and shifted trade away from old Mobeetie. The town did not die at once. It thinned the way a creek thins in drought. The stores closed one at a time. The freight routes moved. The families who depended on army trade and cattle traffic followed the money east toward the new rail towns. Dempsey sold his storehouse, with its stone floor quietly installed, never mentioned in his presence, and moved to Amarillo, where he sold hardware and never spoke about the years on Sweetwater Creek. Abner Rowe died in 1897 in his bed, in a cabin with a stone floor that Marit had laid herself the winter after the norther. He was 71. His last request, delivered to Etta in a voice that had gone thin and careful, was that someone check the ash bed in the spring and re-tamp the settled corner near the north wall, because he had felt a draft there in January, and it bothered him. Etta continued teaching at the schoolhouse until her eyes failed in the early 1900s, and then she sat in the back row of the preparation circle and listened to Marit teach and corrected her from memory when the ash ratios drifted, because Etta's memory for numbers outlasted her memory for faces, and the ratios mattered more. The knowledge moved the way heat moves through stone, slowly, steadily, without hurry, without loss. By the second hard winter after the norther 27 cabins and one schoolhouse in the Sweetwater Creek area used some version of the stone bed method that Marit and Adella had built. Not all were perfect. Some were only hearth extensions, a few square feet of stone near the stove and nothing more. But the habit had changed. People dried stones before storms. They saved ash through the summer. They patched stove plates and checked floor gaps and thought, before the first cold front, about how slowly a room gives its heat away. Marit lived out her life near the same creek where she had hauled the stones. In later years, children sent to borrow the mason's hammer were told to bring it back clean, because it belonged first to Adella Carvajal, and before that to Esteban Carvajal, and before that to the knowledge itself, which was older than any of them. Marit died in 1916. In the cabin, Orrin had expanded twice but never moved, with the stone floor beneath the boards and the hammer on its nail beside the stove. In the winter of 1887, a cowboy passing through the settlement had stopped his horse and watched a widow on her knees in a roofless cabin, floorboards ripped up, creek stones stacked beside the door, and had said to the man riding with him, "The widow's burying herself indoors." Decades later, during another norther, Merritt's old cabin stood dark after the fire had died. The stove was cold. The pipe was silent. Snow drove against the walls, and the temperature outside fell past the point where exposed skin dies in minutes. But under the centerboards, in the space where Marit had tamped the ash bed and seeded each stone with Adella's hammer and swept sand into every gap with hands that bled and bled again, the stones still held enough warmth to melt one small ring in the frost around a sleeping child's hand. The winter gave her one day, and she taught the floor to remember it.